She shoved his paperwork back without even reading it, eyes locked on his skin like it was a mistake. Her voice loud enough for the whole bank to hear as she told him he didn't belong there. Not in that lobby, not in that suit, not with that confidence. People turned. No one helped. He stood there, a black man surrounded by silence, stripped of dignity not with violence, but with grins, whispers, and rules that shifted every time he got too close to the door they were guarding. They thought he was just another name to erase. They didn't know who he really was. Not yet. This isn't just a story about cruelty. It's about what happens when the one they tried to humiliate decides to rewrite the rules. If that opening hit you, like the video, hit subscribe so you don't miss the twist coming next, and drop a comment. Where are you watching from? And how would you handle that moment if it were you? Brian Miles stepped through the glass doors of Grayson Federal Bank with his back straight and hands calmly gripping a leather folder. The lobby stretched wide and gleaming, flooded with golden light from recessed ceiling panels, bouncing off polished marble and brass finishes that gave the place the sterile glow of curated wealth. Columns loomed like quiet judges. Every detail whispered exclusivity, restraint, control. He moved with quiet deliberation across the floor, coat buttoned, steps even, his expression neutral, not smiling, not guarded, just appropriately blank, the way he'd learned to be in spaces like this. His shoes made soft, quick sounds on the stone, echoing faintly with each step. He approached the receptionist desk and gave his name and the time of his scheduled appointment. She looked up, surprised but polite, then tapped something on her screen. She nodded and said a banker would be with him shortly. He thanked her and stepped back toward the velvet rope leading to the private client queue. He stood there quietly, near a polished planter, carefully out of the way, one hand resting lightly on the folder. He did not fidget. He did not shift. He knew better than to appear impatient. On the far side of the room, Delora Vance stood behind her teller window, observing with a gaze so sharp it seemed to slice past her mascara-lined lids. Her nails clicked on the countertop as she pretended to focus on a transaction, but her eyes never left him. She gave the receptionist a look, barely a movement, more suggestion than command, and then leaned slightly toward the security guard posted by the front entrance. She said something under her breath. The guard straightened, didn't speak, didn't question. He just began shifting closer to Brian. His eyes narrowed slightly, arms folded in front of his chest. Brian felt it, but didn't react. The receptionist avoided his gaze. Customers who came in after him were ushered past the ropes. Some were greeted with hugs, others handshakes. He watched as an elderly couple was escorted to a private suite by a sharply dressed banker. Another woman wearing a fleece vest and carrying a yoga mat was waved forward without hesitation. Brian remained where he was, waiting. When Delora finally approached him, she didn't introduce herself or ask for his name. She merely pointed him toward a small, empty space near the exit, beside a rusted coat stand and an old steel bench. "You'll be more comfortable over there," she said flatly. He glanced at the receptionist, who said nothing. The bench wasn't near any designated waiting area. It was tucked behind a structural column and half hidden by an artificial plant. Still, he moved without a word, seating himself with quiet patience. The guard trailed a few paces behind, then stopped nearby. Delora returned to her station. No one came. Minutes passed. The clock above the door ticked, visible and unhurried. He watched clients come and go. Some had clearly not scheduled appointments. Still, they were greeted, smiled at, served. Brian kept his eyes low, staring at the edge of his folder. At minute 20, he rose again and returned to the counter. Delora barely looked up. When he inquired about Naomi Gerber, she claimed the banker had been pulled into another meeting. His appointment had been canceled. Something came up. Her words were flat, mechanical. When he asked if anyone else could meet with him, she smiled without warmth and said everyone was tied up, short-staffed today. He tried again, a touch more firmly, but she raised her hand, not rudely, just with practiced control, and nodded slightly toward the guard. "There's nothing else we can do, sir," she said. He stood still for a second, silence pressing against him. Around them, clients talked, walked, laughed. The receptionist looked away. The guard stepped forward slightly. Brian turned, picked up his folder, and walked out. As he passed through the revolving door, he caught a flash of Delora speaking to the teller next to her. Her mouth curled into a whisper of a smile. Not because of pride or stubbornness, because something inside him had shifted from numbness to clarity. He re-entered the building quietly, slipping past the front desk and moving toward the second-floor public services counter. He didn't ask for Naomi this time. He simply requested to speak with any available investment associate. The woman at the second-floor desk nodded and asked him to take a seat nearby. There were others waiting, 3, maybe 4 people. But he didn't mind. He sat down, adjusted his folder, and waited. 10 minutes passed. A young white couple was called in. Another man in a sports team jacket was waved ahead. Brian stayed seated. After 25 minutes, he rose and approached the desk again. The woman looked surprised. She hadn't expected him to return. She tapped her keyboard and frowned slightly. Then she told him flatly that all associates were now in back-to-back meetings and would not be available until after lunch. She suggested coming back tomorrow morning. He nodded once and turned to leave. On his way out, he passed Delora Station on the ground floor. She was serving an elderly client, but she saw him. Her eyes followed him, calm and sharp, and as he approached the revolving doors, her voice rose just loud enough for him to hear. "Some people don't get the hint," she said to the other teller beside her. The words weren't meant to be confrontational. They were meant to cut. Brian didn't react. He stepped into the revolving door and walked back out into the wind. This time, he went directly to his car. He sat in the driver's seat, stared straight ahead, and let his hands rest on the wheel. He said nothing. He just sat in silence. The next morning, he returned again. He wore the same jacket, the same boots, the same deliberate composure. He entered the bank at the same hour and walked directly to the reception desk. The same woman from yesterday was there. She didn't greet him with hostility. She didn't greet him at all. When he stated his appointment with Naomi, she glanced at the screen and said she was not in the office today. This time, he asked if she could check her calendar. The receptionist tapped the screen again, then said something that caught him off guard. She said that Naomi Gerber had no record of a scheduled meeting with anyone by his name. Brian opened his folder and pulled out the email confirmation. She skimmed it and blinked. She asked him to wait a moment. He stood back and waited. The moment turned into several. She returned, apologizing slightly, and said there must have been a mix-up. Would he mind waiting again in the side bench while they sorted it out? Brian stood there, folder still in hand. She was looking past him now, over his shoulder, avoiding his eyes. He turned and walked quietly to the same bench near the exit. This time, there was no security guard hovering nearby. But Delora was watching. She stood behind her station again, her face unreadable, her attention fixed. After a few minutes, she approached him. Her smile was razor-thin. She didn't ask him if he needed help. She didn't pretend to be accommodating. Instead, she looked at his boots, the ones he had polished the night before. And she said, still smiling, that certain standards had to be upheld in financial institutions. The comment was vague, but pointed. Brian glanced down at his boots, which were clean, solid, well-maintained. They were not the problem. She didn't stop there. She asked if he had considered wearing something more appropriate for a financial consultation, perhaps a different coat. Brian's coat was tailored, subtle, expensive in a way most wouldn't recognize unless they knew fabric. She didn't know fabric. She knew signals. He stayed silent. She looked at his collar and asked if he had a backup shirt in case of an emergency. He had no idea what that meant. Then she said some clients preferred to look sharp when discussing investments. Some looked like they prepared. She turned and walked away before he could reply. The implication was loud. He didn't look sharp enough. He didn't look prepared. The receptionist did not call him back. After 15 more minutes, Brian stood and returned to the desk. The receptionist said she was sorry. No one would be available today, perhaps next week. He asked if there was any record of him in their system. She hesitated. Then she said no. Brian walked to the door. He passed Delora again. She leaned into her microphone and said something into her headset, just loud enough for the nearby teller to hear. He heard a snicker. Brian stepped outside. He had been degraded. Not loudly, not directly, but through 1,000 small words, through glances, through questions disguised as suggestions. His appearance had been the target, not because it was unkempt, but because it wasn't enough for them to believe he belonged. And they didn't want to believe he belonged. That much was clear. They didn't want him sitting in their chairs, didn't want him walking their floor. They didn't want to see someone like him with confidence, with paperwork, with a folder. They didn't want to imagine him as a client, only as an intruder. He wasn't angry, not yet. He was disappointed, not surprised, just tired. He looked up at the glass and marble structure of Grayson Federal and saw it for what it truly was. Not just a bank, a stage, a theater where people like him were meant to feel lesser, where appearance alone was treated as disqualifying, not because of wrinkles or stains or scuffs, but because of who wore the suit. And no matter how clean, no matter how pressed, some people would always see the man and not the clothing. He had begun, without realizing it, to wonder whether something he'd worn had given them ammunition, whether his voice had carried wrong, whether walking back in at all had been a mistake. But those thoughts only lasted until he remembered the years he'd spent building a company out of dust and spreadsheets and late nights with one light on in a rented storage unit. He remembered payroll deadlines and renegotiated contracts, and weeks spent sleeping 4 hours a night so he could do everything with no one's help. He didn't owe them more polish. They owed him basic decency. So on the third day, Brian returned to Grayson Federal. He arrived 15 minutes early. He wore the same coat, the same shoes, the same quiet expression. And this time, he asked not for Naomi Gerber, not for an investment associate, not for a teller. He asked to speak to the branch's senior banking officer. The receptionist looked at him with polite uncertainty and asked for his name. He gave it. She asked if he had an appointment. He did not. But he explained, calmly and professionally, that he had attempted to receive assistance multiple times over the past several days and had been denied without reasonable explanation. The receptionist stiffened and said she would see what she could do. She left her post and returned 10 minutes later with a man in his mid-40s, tall and balding, with a maroon tie and a neutral smile. His name was Clinton Maris, the Client Services Director for the branch. He extended a hand and introduced himself with the measured tone of someone trained to defuse conflict, not to acknowledge fault. Brian took the handshake, held his folder with his other hand, and politely requested a few moments of Mr. Maris's time to explain his position. Mr. Maris led him into a glass-walled office that sat at the far end of the lobby. Inside were 2 leather chairs, a chrome desk, and a shelf of unread hardback books designed to give the illusion of professionalism. Brian sat. He didn't lean back. He didn't cross his legs. He sat upright, his folder resting across his lap, and spoke with deliberate calm. He explained his prior appointment with Naomi, the way it had mysteriously vanished from the system, the way he had been redirected to a back corner bench, the multiple instances in which he had been passed over despite arriving early, and the behavior of the staff on each visit, particularly the way Delora Van had spoken to him. He kept his voice even. He presented facts. He asked for no special treatment. He simply wanted to know why he was being treated differently and what recourse existed for a client who had not yet been allowed to speak to a banker. Mr. Maris listened with his hands folded on the desk. When Brian finished, there was a long pause. Then Maris smiled gently and asked for the name on the appointment again. Brian gave it. Maris tapped into the system and nodded slowly. Then he looked up and said something Brian did not expect. He said, according to their records, the appointment had indeed been entered, then later canceled internally. Brian asked by whom. Maris said it didn't specify. Brian asked if clients typically had their appointments canceled without notification. Maris said no, that was highly unusual. Brian asked if he could speak to another banker. Maris shifted slightly and said that, unfortunately, Due to internal scheduling adjustments and confidentiality protocols, the staff may not be available to speak with someone whose background had not yet been properly verified through their premium vetting process. Brian frowned and asked what that meant. Maris explained that their premium service required certain risk assessment checks to be completed before sensitive consultations. Brian said he had never heard of such a process and that it had not been mentioned at any point in prior correspondence. Maris said it was an internal safeguard and not always disclosed in early communications. Brian opened his folder and showed him the confirmation email. There was no mention of such a policy. Maris studied the page, nodded, and said again that he understood the confusion but was unable to override internal protocols without clearance. Then he stood. Brian remained seated for several seconds, his breath steady, his expression unreadable. He asked one more time if a client with a confirmation and identification could speak with the banker. Maris said no, not at this time. Brian stood. Maris extended his hand again. Brian didn't take it this time. He simply thanked him for the explanation and walked out. As he crossed the lobby, Delora looked up from her station and smiled, not with kindness, but with satisfaction. She leaned to the teller beside her and whispered something while glancing in his direction. The teller looked down quickly, saying nothing. Brian left the building. Outside, he walked slowly toward his car, the folder still clutched in his hand. He didn't unlock the door right away. He stood there for a moment, processing what had just happened. He had requested to speak to someone with authority. He had followed every step, spoken clearly, dressed professionally, been patient. And still, he had been dismissed. But worse than that, he had been disqualified. Not based on conduct, not based on merit, based on a policy that didn't exist until he asked the wrong questions. He had been undermined by silence, by vagueness, by the deliberate use of structure to deny access. He had walked into the bank, believing that truth and composure were enough, that being articulate and prepared would carry weight. Instead, he had discovered that the system would always find a way to make him seem like a disruption. And the people who enforced that system would always smile while doing it. He opened the car door, stepped inside, and sat behind the wheel for a long time. He didn't drive away. He stared at the steering wheel, at his hands resting on it, and thought about all the times he had walked into rooms with his shoulders back and his chin high, only to be told, in a dozen small ways, that he didn't belong. They had simply redirected, delayed, and dismissed him under the banner of process and protocol, using the structure of their institution as a wall to keep him outside it. It was calculated, wrapped in policy, reinforced by tone and implication, and done with surgical efficiency. That night he reviewed every document he had prepared, reread the confirmation email, scrolled through archived messages, and rechecked the financial statements he'd planned to present. Nothing was missing. Nothing was out of place. There had been no error on his part. The failure was theirs, and it was not one of logistics, it was one of intent. The next morning, Brian dressed in the same coat, the same shirt, the same deliberate composure he'd carried in each time before. He arrived precisely at opening hour and asked, once again, for Naomi Gerber. The receptionist, a different one this time, checked the system and politely informed him that Ms. Gerber was unavailable due to a scheduling conflict. Brian asked if she could check again. She hesitated, glanced at someone behind the counter, then nodded and excused herself. She returned moments later, saying that per branch guidance, clients without full premium status were advised to consult through the standard banker rotation system. Brian asked what the standard system entailed. She explained that it involved a separate appointment queue with randomized assignment based on availability, not preference or request. Brian asked why that hadn't been mentioned during any of his previous visits. She simply repeated the explanation, then offered a QR code on a laminated stand to schedule through their rotating system. Brian stared at the QR code, unmoving. He asked if he could schedule through her, as he had done before. She said, with a carefully measured voice, that the branch no longer accepted in-person scheduling without approval. Approval from whom? Brian asked. She said compliance management. He asked to speak with someone from compliance. She said they were not stationed on site. When Brian asked how to reach them, She handed him a generic email printed on a business card with no name, only a department title and address. Brian took the card, glanced at it, and placed it in his folder. He thanked her, turned, and walked away. He passed Delora again. This time she didn't speak. She didn't smile. But her eyes followed him, bright with silent amusement, as if watching someone try to push against glass that would never shatter. Outside, the wind had lost its chill. The city was coming to life. Coffee carts screeching along sidewalks, briefcases swinging, pedestrians wrapped in the business of movement. But Brian stood still. He had now been redirected 4 times in 4 days, each time by someone who insisted on rules that hadn't been mentioned before. He had been moved from queue to bench, from receptionist to director, from banker to scheduler, always one step away from access, but never across the threshold. They had built a system of walls without ever naming them. The next day, Brian arrived again, but this time, he came with everything printed, every message, every confirmation, every name and timestamp. He carried it all in a slim case and walked to the receptionist with the same expression, neither aggressive nor pleading, just steady. He asked to speak to any associate on duty. The receptionist asked for his name. He gave it. She checked the system. Then her expression changed. She asked him to hold. A few minutes later, a man he had not seen before approached, a mid-level associate named Darren Price, who greeted Brian with an overcompensating smile. He apologized for the confusion over the last few days and said he would be happy to help. Brian followed him through the lobby into a consultation room. Inside, the air was colder. A monitor glowed faintly on the wall. The table was bare. Brian sat down, opened his case, and began laying out the documents, appointment confirmations, messages, printed records. Darren smiled but didn't look at them closely. He nodded often, said yes, of course, that makes sense, but his eyes darted to the corners of the room like he was waiting for someone else to arrive. After 10 minutes, Darren said he needed to step out briefly to consult with a manager. Brian waited. 15 minutes passed. Then 20. At 30 minutes, Darren returned with another man, Clinton Maris again. Maris looked at Brian as if surprised to see him there, though his face betrayed no emotion. Maris said, without sitting, that there had been a further policy update. Brian would now need to complete a revised client verification form, effective immediately for all prospective premium clients. Brian asked to see the form. Maris handed him a packet of legal pages with vague criteria and sections requesting unnecessary personal disclosures. Brian asked when this policy had been implemented. Maris said it had been introduced that week due to regulatory changes. Brian said it seemed odd that none of the other clients entering that morning were asked to complete the form. Maris didn't answer. Brian placed the form on the table and asked if he was being singled out. Maris said the policy applied to all new applications. Brian pointed out that he wasn't a new applicant. He had come to complete an appointment already confirmed. Maris only said that to move forward, full completion of the revised process was non-negotiable. Then he added that if Brian failed to provide the requested documents, the bank reserved the right to terminate prospective discussions. Brian nodded. He closed his folder and stood. Maris extended a hand. Brian didn't shake it. As he walked out of the room, Darren mumbled something behind him. Brian heard the word overprepared, followed by a short laugh. Brian returned to the lobby, past the counter where Delora stood watching with one hand on her keyboard, and exited into the late morning air. He did not hesitate on the steps. He did not glance back. The building behind him, with its polished walls and brass accents, no longer looked impressive. It looked hollow. He walked to his car, opened the door, sat down, and placed the folder in the passenger seat. He stared through the windshield, not at the bank, but beyond it. They wanted him to push back, to raise his voice, to question them just a bit too forcefully, to give them justification for the picture they were so carefully painting of him. That of a man who could not be trusted with civility, a man too emotional, too reactive, too dangerous for delicate financial dealings. That morning, Brian adjusted his tie in the mirror and told himself the most important truth of the week. Control would be his resistance. He arrived at Grayson Federal with the calm of a man who knew he was being watched and didn't intend to blink. He stepped into the marble lobby, nodded once at the new receptionist, and walked to the front desk. He said his name, said he had been instructed to complete the new client verification paperwork, and asked to be directed to someone who could assist him in doing so. The receptionist blinked, surprised, and told him to wait. Within minutes, Darren Price returned, his smile tighter now, less eager. He gestured for Brian to follow him to the same consultation room as before. Brian entered, sat down without being told, and pulled the completed form from his folder. He placed it on the table, neatly aligned with the edge, and said nothing. Darren picked it up, flipped through the first 2 pages, then paused. He said one section was incomplete. Brian explained that section referred to a financial instrument he did not hold and was irrelevant to his case. Darren hesitated, nodded, then stood up, saying he needed to consult with compliance. Brian waited again. When the door opened, it wasn't Darren who returned. It was Delora Van. She walked in with a file in hand, her expression neutral, but eyes sharp with something colder than indifference. She set the file on the table, remained standing, and asked if Brian had been assisted. Brian said yes. Delora opened the file and said there had been a report submitted by a member of staff detailing an incident the previous day involving behavior that had made them uncomfortable. Brian blinked. He asked what behavior was being referred to. Delora said she could not share the specifics of internal reports, only that Grayson Federal took concerns from its staff seriously, and that any incident of perceived hostility would be reviewed before further client engagement could continue. Brian remained seated. He asked if he was being accused of misconduct. Delora said no, not officially, but that until the report was resolved, he would not be able to proceed with onboarding as a client. Brian asked what the next step would be. Delora said a review panel, possibly legal, depending on the outcome. Brian asked how long such a process might take. She said it depended on the cooperation of all parties involved. Brian sat back slowly in his chair. He folded his hands on top of his folder and asked if any of the interactions from the past several days had been documented from his side. Delora smiled without warmth and said client service interactions were reviewed on a case-by-case basis. Brian stood. He looked at her carefully, saw the calculation behind her eyes, and felt the trap tightening. He asked one final time if there had been any instance where he had raised his voice, made threats, or acted outside the bounds of standard customer behavior. Delora said she could not speak to interpretations, only to reports. He walked past her without another word. Out in the lobby, the security guard, an older man who had been silent all week, stepped forward and asked if everything was all right. Brian said it was. He didn't stop walking. Behind him, the receptionist was whispering to someone on the phone, her eyes flicking toward his back as he reached the revolving door. The sunlight outside had shifted, casting hard angles across the pavement, and for a brief moment Brian stood on the steps, folder still in his hand, and felt the full weight of the bank behind him, not as a building, but as a system, not as a collection of people, but as a single coordinated force. They had done it. They had framed him in a narrative of threat without ever naming it, relying on fear, on assumption, on the subtle poison of suggestion. They hadn't needed him to do anything wrong. They had only needed to say that he might. And now that idea would stick. No matter what he did next, it would follow him. It would linger in notes and logs, and whispered exchanges behind closed doors. They had set a legal landmine under the polished floor and dared him to step harder. That night, Brian reviewed his calendar and canceled every remaining meeting for the week. He opened his laptop, logged into his encrypted financial systems, and reviewed all associated accounts linked to Grayson Federal's holdings. He began drafting letters. He contacted his internal counsel. He compiled every email, every timestamped detail, and forwarded them to a separate record server. But he did not react publicly. He did not send threats or warnings. He documented. He prepared. The next morning, he did not return to the bank. He stayed home, brewed coffee, and watched the wind move through the trees outside his window. He opened a blank page and began writing a statement. All they needed was the perception that his presence had made someone uncomfortable. And from that single allegation, they had manufactured a barrier strong enough to freeze any further engagement. He understood now that the game had changed. The rules were fluid. The floor kept shifting. But the intent remained fixed. They wanted him out, and if exclusion through policy had not worked, they would move on to spectacle. On the fourth morning, Brian returned, not because he expected them to welcome him, but because he knew silence was no longer protection. He arrived just before the bank opened and stood near the glass doors, watching employees file in with their lanyards and paper cups, their brief hellos and strategic avoidance of his gaze. The receptionist saw him and blinked, startled, before disappearing into a back hallway. A few minutes later, the security guard approached, not the older man from before, but a new officer, younger, taller, built with a visible edge of anticipation. He asked Brian to step aside, not with hostility, but with a practiced tone of authority. Brian complied without speaking. He was guided through the front entrance, but directed away from the normal client path, and instead down a narrow corridor lined with frosted glass and beige carpet. At the end of the hall was a door marked Staff Services. It wasn't a meeting room. It wasn't a consultation space. It was where maintenance forms were filed, where off-duty staff took their 15-minute breaks, where cluttered bulletin boards held outdated notices. The guard opened the door, gestured inside, and Brian stepped through. There was a single metal chair, a plastic table, and a camera pointed at the corner of the ceiling. Brian asked if this was where he would be meeting a representative. The guard said someone would be with him shortly. Then he stepped out and closed the door. Brian sat alone. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. The air was stale, tinged with a faint smell of industrial cleaner and yesterday's coffee. The walls were marked with scuff lines. On the table sat a cracked plastic clipboard. Brian kept his eyes on the door. At 30 minutes, it opened. Delora Van entered, accompanied by the same compliance associate who had never returned his emails. Delora said the bank had reviewed the previous concerns and, given the ongoing sensitivity of the issue, was requiring that all further communication with Brian occur off the client floor to ensure operational continuity. Brian asked if this space was a formal meeting room. The associate said it was an appropriate setting for the purposes of document handling and clarification. Brian asked if any other client was currently being served under the same restriction. Neither answered. Brian said he would remain until the form processing was complete. They gave him a new version of the verification packet, with 2 additional pages that had not been included before. Brian pointed this out. Delora said they were updates implemented across all branches. Brian asked for a copy of the policy rollout schedule. The associate said such materials were internal. Brian began filling out the form again. He worked slowly, making sure each line was legible. He handed it back and asked for confirmation of receipt. Delora nodded without speaking. Brian stood. As he turned to leave, the door opened again, and the security guard from earlier reappeared. He said Brian would need to exit through the rear access hallway due to restricted movement across the main lobby during peak hours. Brian asked if this restriction applied to all clients. The guard did not answer. He simply held the door open. Brian followed him through a narrow passage past staff mailboxes and stacked boxes of printer paper. The hallway was unmarked, poorly lit, the walls stained near the baseboards. At the end, a back door buzzed open electronically, and Brian stepped out into an alley lined with trash bins and broken concrete. The door locked behind him. He stood there for several seconds, the sound of distant traffic humming behind the buildings, the alley smelling of exhaust and wet cardboard. He did not move. He did not curse. He did not look back. He took a slow breath and walked to the street. He had been removed through a door reserved for waste and supplies, routed away from the customers he had once intended to become one of. He had been led down a hallway that existed to keep eyes from seeing things they didn't need to see. And in that moment, he realized the bank had finally made their message unmistakable. This wasn't about procedure. This was about erasure. They did not want a confrontation. They wanted invisibility. They wanted him gone so thoroughly that even his exit would happen out of sight, away from the polished floors and soft music and smiling tellers. They had made a spectacle of his presence by forcing his absence. That afternoon, Brian sat in his apartment and wrote down every detail. The conversation, the walk down the hallway, the smell of the alley, the temperature of the room. He documented it all, line by line, not because he planned to share it immediately, but because facts had become his last defense against a narrative already being written in whispers and half-statements behind the counters of Grayson Federal. They had tried to turn his dignity into an inconvenience, his patience into a threat, and now they were turning his presence into a disruption. He understood the strategy, the quiet violence of orchestrated humiliation. If they couldn't provoke him into an outburst, they would make his existence so uncomfortable, so logistically impossible, that he would choose to leave. But he had not left. Not yet. And despite their efforts to rout him out of the building like unwanted inventory, he had remained composed, recorded, and deliberate. He had made no threats. He had raised no voice. But they had pushed the line again. And this time, the entire mechanism of that humiliation, the escort, the relocation, the refusal to allow him to walk out the front doors like every other client, had been executed in full view of their own internal structure. They had tried to shrink him into nothingness, to bury his dignity beneath procedures, redirection, and now isolation. But instead of erasing him, they had sharpened him. He didn't pace. He didn't mutter to himself. He stood still in front of the glass doors, calm and unmoved, dressed as he always had been, folder in hand, coat pressed, shoes polished, not because he hoped to prove anything anymore, but because he understood that composure was not surrender. He waited until the branch opened and then stepped inside, greeted by the same lobby he had seen all week, the same columns and marble floors, but this time he walked directly to the center of the room, not to the reception desk or a teller station, but to the very heart of the bank's entryway, where every client and employee would have to pass him to reach their destination. He stood still, facing the reception desk, folder tucked under his arm, expression steady. When the receptionist looked up, she didn't greet him. Instead, her eyes widened slightly before she picked up the phone and began to dial. Brian said nothing. He did not move. Within moments, Darren Price approached, his gait stiffer than usual, his smile forced. He asked if Brian would be willing to step into a side room. Brian shook his head once, slowly. He said he would remain where he stood until someone with the authority to speak on behalf of Grayson Federal Bank's parent company came to speak with him. Darren said the branch didn't have those kinds of contacts on site. Brian said he knew that. Then he opened his folder and withdrew a letter, sealed in a gold-trimmed envelope, and placed it on the counter. He said it was addressed to the Grayson Holding Group's executive board. Darren's face tightened. He asked what the letter contained. Brian said it contained a formal declaration of withdrawal and restructuring of all assets held by Soliton Equity Group and its subsidiaries, totaling $2.3 billion. Darren blinked and asked if that was a threat. Brian said nothing. He pulled out a second document, a notarized instruction set authorizing immediate liquidation of all short-term holdings connected to Grayson Federal and reallocation to a competing institution already vetted through his firm's legal division. By now, Delora Van had emerged from behind her teller station and stood frozen near the side entrance, lips parted, eyes fixed on the documents. The security guard, unsure whether to intervene, hovered nearby, but made no move to stop him. Brian remained calm, posture straight, gaze direct, as he explained to Darren that every interaction over the last several days had been documented, time-stamped, and witnessed where applicable, and that the systematic denial of service based on manufactured procedures, vague accusations, and intentional humiliation constituted grounds not only for financial withdrawal, but for formal inquiry through the office of the comptroller. Darren opened his mouth, but said nothing. Brian handed him a third document, a signed affidavit prepared by Soliton's general counsel, detailing not only the pattern of obstruction, but also naming individuals who had participated in or enabled discriminatory behavior during his attempts to conduct lawful business. The silence in the lobby deepened. A few clients entering the bank paused, confused by the stillness. Brian did not raise his voice. He did not point. He did not need to. His presence now carried the full weight of the truth they had tried to ignore. He told Darren that he would remain in the building until he received confirmation that his instructions had been processed and that a written statement of completion had been signed and delivered to the holding company's counsel. Darren, visibly shaken, said he would need to contact someone. Brian nodded. Darren disappeared into a back hallway. Brian returned to his position in the center of the room and waited. He watched Delora try to retreat back behind the counter but stumble as she turned. Her confidence eroded by the shift she could now feel spreading across the room. She had spent days building a cage of invisibility around him, confident that the quiet cruelty she delivered would never find consequence. But now that same cage stood around her. The glass that had hidden her actions now reflected them back. Brian stood quietly for 20 minutes until a senior officer from the regional division arrived. His face flushed, his suit half wrinkled, as if he had been pulled from a rushed meeting. He introduced himself with hesitation and asked Brian to step into the boardroom upstairs. Brian agreed. Inside the boardroom, he presented the officer with the documentation again, reviewed the timeline of events, cited federal compliance, standards violated through discriminatory obstruction, and explained that this was not a demand for apology, not an appeal for compensation, but a final act of professional clarity. The officer listened in silence. When Brian concluded, he asked if there was anything the bank could do to repair the situation. Brian said that repair was not the objective. Accountability was. The officer nodded slowly and said he would personally oversee the withdrawal and ensure its execution within 24 hours. Brian stood, gathered his documents, and walked calmly back down through the bank lobby. The receptionist watched him with wide eyes. Now every single eye that had once glazed over him now followed his movements with a nervous curiosity, not knowing whether to see him as the same person or as something far more consequential. And he didn't slow. He moved with the same deliberate steps, leather folder under his arm, shoulders squared, breath measured. But now the calmness came not from hope, but from certainty. Behind those doors, executives were already making calls they had never anticipated having to place. Voices rising behind closed office glass, directors chasing conference lines with regional compliance, and branch managers pulling internal logs to check timelines they thought no one would ever verify. He didn't need to stay and watch it unfold. His work was already in motion. As he stepped into his car and turned the ignition, his phone buzzed once, a silent alert that a sequence of transactions had been approved. The transfer of Soliton Equity Group's liquid funds, a full-scale removal of $2.3 billion in assets, was underway. No alarms, no headlines, just a quiet reallocation that would be noticed by those who understood the language of capital, those who lived by numbers and exposure and risk ratios. Brian drove toward his firm's downtown office, not because he needed to issue further instructions. Those had already been encrypted and distributed to the legal and financial teams the night before, but because he understood that presence mattered. When he entered the Soliton boardroom an hour later, a team of 5 sat waiting. They rose when he stepped in, their expressions tight, measured, the room thick with anticipation. Brian placed his folder on the table, nodded once, and said 2 words: execute everything. Phones came out. Keyboards clicked. Compliance officers began pushing formal withdrawal notices to every Grayson affiliate holding corporate accounts. Human Resources prepared internal statements to explain the sudden severance to staff attached to Grayson-sponsored benefits. Marketing updated talking points for press queries. Meanwhile, Brian watched the stock tickers rise and fall on the screen at the end of the table. At 10:23 a.m., Grayson Holding Group's shares dipped by 3 points. At 10:37 a.m., they fell by 6. By 11:12, financial analysts on the East Coast began circulating alerts about large-scale account movements from one of Grayson's top-tier equity partners. By noon, Grayson's regional boardroom, filled with unfamiliar names until that morning, was now overrun with calls from investors, board members, and national directors, each demanding answers. Inside the bank, Delora Van was pulled into a conference room she had never entered before. Her badge access had already been suspended. Her workstation had been locked. A compliance officer, no smile, no warmth, read a series of statements back to her, requesting explanations for behavior documented through security reports, customer complaint logs, and recorded observations submitted anonymously by 2 internal staffers who had witnessed her interactions with Brian. She tried to deny the language she had used, tried to redirect blame, but the words were already written, and her name had already been attached. Upstairs, Clinton Maris sat frozen at his desk, the legal department requesting digital copies of every meeting he had conducted involving Brian Miles. His inbox was flooded with requests from headquarters for a full compliance review. The phone rang and rang, each call heavier than the last, each one peeling away the illusion that this could be buried quietly. Brian, meanwhile, did not smile. He made no speeches, no announcements, no triumphant declarations. Instead, he called his assistant and requested a summary report of the final transfer confirmations and instructed the operations lead to lock Soliton's access credentials to Grayson servers permanently. He didn't care for vengeance. He cared for precedent. Across the city, small ripples of the event began to surface. Financial blogs picked up the transfer volume. Analysts guessed at the source. But internally, the truth spread fast. Word passed through boardrooms and elevators and shared lunches between departments. Someone had tried to diminish a man who held the power to collapse a corridor of influence with a single signature. That someone had mistaken silence for weakness. And now, the collapse was not just financial. It was reputational. Investors called for explanations. Partner banks froze non-essential activity with Grayson until further notice. The chairman of Grayson's parent company requested a crisis briefing by end of day. Brian, alone in his office as dusk approached, stared out the window and let the hum of traffic below blend with the rhythm of what he had orchestrated. There was no celebration. There was no bitterness. Just the recognition that justice didn't always come through courts or headlines or viral moments. Sometimes it came through structure, precision, and silence so undeniable that those who had built their careers on arrogance found themselves answering for every quiet cruelty they once delivered without fear. That night, Delora received an email from corporate. Her access was revoked, her employment terminated, and a mandatory ethics report attached to her personnel file. Maris was placed on indefinite leave pending the outcome of the investigation. Analysts scrambled to recalculate. Partnerships scheduled emergency meetings. Senior executives flooded inboxes with reassurances that no one believed. But for Brian, the weight of what had occurred did not settle in excitement or satisfaction. It rested with quiet certainty, a measured reminder that justice carried the most weight when it was delivered not with rage, but with irreversible consequence. By 9 o'clock that morning, Grayson Federal's legal department had completed internal documentation identifying several employees flagged for review, including Delora Van, Clinton Maris, and Darren Price. Each had been linked to escalating actions that contributed to the discriminatory obstruction Brian had faced, and each had underestimated the chain of accountability that now held them in its grip. Delora, who had once leaned over her teller station with smug assurance, arrived at the branch that morning only to find her ID badge unresponsive at the front entrance. She tried again, tapping the scanner harder, her hand beginning to shake. The guard inside, previously indifferent to her comings and goings, now approached slowly and asked her to wait. A few minutes later, the regional operations manager met her at the door and informed her that her access had been suspended pending final HR review. Delora protested, demanded an explanation, cited her years of employment and clean disciplinary record, but the manager, stone-faced and unmoved, handed her a sealed envelope and said she could contact corporate for further discussion. Inside the envelope was a termination letter citing multiple breaches of ethical conduct, willful interference with client access, and participation in discriminatory practices documented through witness statements and incident reports. Her hands trembled as she read it. The humiliation she had once directed at others now collapsed inward. She had believed herself protected, reinforced by a system that rarely questioned the behavior of those at the front lines. But Brian's methodical unraveling had exposed her, stripped away the safety of anonymity, and now left her with nothing but her own actions to account for. Clinton Maris sat alone in a fourth-floor conference room with his tie loosened and his laptop dark, the blinds drawn to shut out the morning light. He had received an internal memo from corporate the night before outlining his removal from client services operations, pending a compliance review that would be conducted by an external legal team. His name had been listed in the Soliton Equity Withdrawal Report under a section titled Institutional Obstruction and Ethical Complicity. He had read it 3 times, each sentence tightening around his chest. He had never raised his voice. He had never said anything offensive. But he had also never intervened. He had watched Brian be redirected, watched him be denied, and had chosen to speak in circles rather than offer help. He had leaned on policy not because he believed it was right, but because it was easier than confronting the system that rewarded his silence. And now the system had turned. Compliance investigators interviewed him one by one, asking about specific meetings, timelines, emails, and whether he had witnessed staff creating obstacles without justification. He tried to answer carefully, but the dates betrayed him. The reports conflicted, and the narrative he thought he could control had already moved on without him. Darren Price sat hunched at his desk, surrounded by documents he no longer had the authority to file, his computer access restricted to internal memos only. He had received a formal warning with language that mirrored the internal report filed by Brian's legal team. Evidence of professional misconduct, misrepresentation of policy, and failure to escalate client concerns in accordance with ethical standards. He had tried to downplay his involvement, insisting he had simply followed instructions, but the internal audit showed otherwise. His emails had contained language suggesting mockery, casual references to Brian's persistence, and tone that reflected the same dismissive arrogance now being scrutinized. Every keystroke, once thought invisible, now stood in full view. Elsewhere in the company, directors who had never heard Brian's name before were now poring over internal logs, discovering inconsistencies in client engagement practices, unaddressed complaints from other minority clients, and long-ignored requests for service that mirrored Brian's experience. The cracks were no longer theoretical. They were structural. Branches across the state received notifications mandating ethics training, inclusion protocol reassessments, and mandatory reviews of client interactions flagged for potential discrimination. But the consequences weren't confined to internal operations. News of the financial exodus, though not leaked publicly in detail, reached investors through subtle cues. Changes in quarterly forecasts, abrupt cancellations of scheduled rollouts, and whispers among analyst circles about a major equity partner's abrupt departure. Stockholders began demanding answers. The boardroom, once confident and insulated, was now fractured. Emergency calls were made to public relations firms, legal consultants, and diversity strategists in a bid to salvage what little trust remained. Grayson's CEO, who had spent the previous week in Europe on a speaking tour, returned to a crisis brief that listed Brian Miles by name and detailed the chain of events that had led to the withdrawal. He read the timeline in silence. He didn't speak when he reached the final line of the report. All attempts to mitigate client loss were denied by the client, citing ethical grounds. Brian, for his part, remained still. He didn't gloat. He didn't share the news with colleagues or publish statements. He continued with his normal schedule, overseeing projects, meeting with department heads, and reviewing reports as though nothing had changed. But those close to him noticed the difference. His silence was no longer the silence of endurance. Weeks passed after the collapse of Grayson Federal's image, not in fire or fury, but in quiet administrative shame, reshaped budgets, and closed-door reassignments. Its leadership shifted like tectonic plates under a slow-moving reckoning, each decision now haunted by the names, faces, and documents they once ignored. Brian Miles, meanwhile, kept moving forward. He continued leading Soliton Equity Group with a calm hand and sharp focus, pushing into new initiatives, launching funding programs for communities long locked out of access, and building what the system had once denied. Yet behind him, In the corners of the structure he had left fractured, a slower transformation had begun, not one of vengeance, but of reflection. It started with Delora Van. The email severing her employment had felt like the ground opening beneath her feet, sudden and complete. She had spent nearly a decade behind that teller glass, believing herself untouchable in her polished uniform and subtle sneers. But the letter had stripped away that illusion. She had boxed her things in silence. No one offered help. No one made eye contact. For the first time in years, she had walked out through the same back exit she once forced others through. Only now it was her shame echoing in every step. At first, she blamed the system. She blamed Brian. She told herself it wasn't fair, that everyone bent rules, that she hadn't meant anything by it. But over time, without the badge, without the title, she had to sit in the reality of what she had done. The transcripts surfaced in her inbox. Statements, timelines, her own words quoted back at her without edits. They weren't just impolite. They were cruel. And the cruelest part was how easily she had said them, how naturally they came. It took weeks before she stopped justifying and started examining. In that silence, with no income and no offers, she found herself visiting the public library for internet access. It was there, beneath the dim light of an old monitor, that she stumbled upon an article about a community finance workshop operating out of an old storefront in the South District. It had been started by a private donor, anonymous, staffed by volunteers, focused on teaching financial literacy to young adults and first-time borrowers. She applied without expectation, leaving off her banking history and listing only office experience. The interview was brief. The coordinator didn't ask about her past. They only asked why she wanted to help. She said she had spent too long behind glass and wanted to work somewhere that looked people in the eye. The coordinator smiled and handed her a schedule. Delora's first weeks were quiet. She restocked pamphlets, refilled coffee, and took notes during group sessions. But slowly, she began to listen differently, with a posture of humility instead of expertise. She heard frustration, hesitation, and the familiar tone of clients unsure if they were being taken seriously. She began to see her own voice in the things they feared. And that recognition changed her. She began taking night classes in community development. She started designing simplified budgeting tools for clients who didn't trust banks. She learned how to say less and hear more. The sting of what she had done never left her, but instead of hiding from it, she learned to let it teach her. Elsewhere, Clinton Maris sat in his home office, his title gone, his future uncertain, sifting through compliance literature and federal ethics guidelines, not because of an assignment, but because he finally wanted to understand the responsibilities he had once ignored. He applied for consulting work and was denied again and again, not because of lack of experience, but because of the growing trail of consequences that followed him. One day he received a packet in the mail, anonymous, but inside was a single printed quote from a federal oversight report. Leadership is not defined by the policies you enforce, but by the harm you allow through silence. He read it 3 times. Then he turned off his monitor and sat in the quiet of his own thoughts, finally facing what he had chosen not to see when it mattered. He reached out to an old colleague now working in nonprofit financial services and asked if there were any roles for someone willing to relearn from the ground up. The colleague didn't promise anything, but sent a list of volunteer opportunities. Maris chose the lowest profile one and showed up the next week in jeans and a plain shirt, listening more than he spoke. As for Darren Price, the youngest among them and perhaps the most casual in his cruelty, his removal wasn't immediate but inevitable. The formal warning stripped his chances for promotion. Colleagues avoided his desk. Clients stopped requesting his consultation. In time, he was reassigned to administrative holding, then phased out during a departmental restructure. At first, he laughed it off, moved to another state, tried to restart at a credit union. But the past followed. The flagged ethics report attached to his file surfaced in interviews. Doors closed. He found part-time work in a community center helping with data entry. The role was menial, but the people were real. He saw kids whose parents had never trusted financial systems, teenagers whose first paychecks were wasted out of ignorance, not laziness. He remembered the look on Brian's face when he'd offered that fake smile and vague answers. He remembered how easily he had dismissed someone who had walked in more prepared than half the clients he had praised. And slowly, Darren stopped blaming the fallout and started owning it. Months later, that community center launched a youth finance program. Darren asked if he could help teach. Not lead, just help. The coordinator said yes. At the first session, he stood behind the table, held a worksheet in his hands, and said simply, "I used to sit behind a bank desk. I thought that made me smart, but I never learned anything until I left it." The students looked at him with curiosity, not judgment. And he continued. Back in the heart of the city, the former Grayson Federal Branch had been renamed and restructured under new leadership, stripped of its previous signage and staff, now transformed into a public-facing credit partnership built on transparency, community access, and oversight. A quiet plaque hung in the corner of the new lobby, listing the names of key partners who made the transition possible. Brian's name wasn't there. By his request, it never would be. He didn't need the credit. He only needed the outcome. And in the last hour of a quiet day, he walked past the building, unrecognized, coat folded over one arm, and saw through the glass a young woman being welcomed at the counter without hesitation. No paperwork fumbled, no suspicion in the air. Just simple dignity. He smiled faintly, kept walking, and let the city fade behind him. Summary of Stage 10. The individuals who once participated in Brian's humiliation face lasting consequences, but are also given the opportunity to reflect and change. Through humility, self-education, and service, they slowly begin to rebuild their lives with intention and integrity. Brian, having delivered justice without spectacle, watches from afar as the institutions that once excluded him begin to transform. His silence becomes a legacy, and his refusal to break becomes a message that systems can be challenged, and that even those complicit in injustice can choose to become better. The end. If this story resonated with you, make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. I'd love to hear what you think. Was there a moment that hit hardest for you? What do you think of Brian's journey? And how would you have handled it if you were in his shoes? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and let me know where you're watching from. Your voice matters here.